In the heart of West Africa, long before the age of European colonization, vast empires and powerful kingdoms had risen and fallen. By the late 18th century, a complex political tapestry stretched across the region between the Niger River and Lake Chad. This region was home to a diversity of ethnic groups, cultures and belief systems, and it stood on the brink of profound transformation. The Sokoto Caliphate, which would soon become the largest pre-colonial state in sub-Saharan Africa, was born not from a sudden conquest, but from years of social, political, and religious change. To understand its origins, one must first return to the older empires that shaped West Africa, and the gradual unraveling of their authority. The decline of the Bonu Empire. For centuries, the most prominent power in the region was the Bonu Empire, centered around Lake Chad. From the 15th to the 17th centuries, Bonu had dominated trade routes, held sway over vast territories, and commanded a large and disciplined military. But by the mid-18th century, Bonu was weakening. Its rulers had lost control of important oases, such as Bilma, cutting off vital trade with North Africa. The trans-Saharan caravan routes were disrupted. A combination of internal instability and external pressure had eroded imperial control. Cities that had once paid tribute began to act independently. By 1780, Bonu was no longer the singular authority it had once been. Instead, a patchwork of autonomous states emerged, each vying for control, wealth, and security in a time of uncertainty. The fall of Songhai and the fragmentation of the Sahel. Farther west, the Songhai Empire, once the most formidable state in West African history, had collapsed in 1591 after an invasion by Moroccan forces. With the fall of Gao and the dispersal of Songhai's leadership, the power vacuum stretched across the central Sahel. In the absence of a unifying empire, smaller states rose to fill the void. Among them were the Hausa city-states, powerful sultanates, such as Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Gobir and Kebbi, each governed by local aristocracies, each competing for trade and territorial dominance. These city-states were centers of commerce and Islamic scholarship, but they were also engaged in constant warfare. Slave raiding had become a primary means of economic and military sustainability. High taxation was imposed on local populations to fund these conflicts. In time, resentment grew among both rural communities and Islamic reformers. The religious climate. Though Islam had entered West Africa as early as the 11th century, its practice varied widely. In urban centers like Kano and Timbuktu, Islamic scholarship flourished. But in many rural areas, Islam was practiced alongside traditional religious beliefs. The resulting syncretism, a blending of Islamic principles with local customs, was seen by some clerics as a corruption of the faith. Reformers, inspired by a return to orthodoxy, began to question the authority of Muslim rulers, who allowed or practiced such syncretism. It was within this context, a world of fragmented states, heavy taxation, competing elites and contested faith, that one man would emerge with a message of reform, unity and resistance. His name was Usman dan Fodio. The scholar from Gobir, Usman dan Fodio, was born in 1754 in Gobir, a Hausa state in what is now northern Nigeria. He belonged to the Torudbe clan of Fulani origin, a group of scholarly Muslims, known for their itinerant teaching and deep knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence. As a young man, Dan Fodio traveled extensively, studying under prominent scholars and eventually becoming a revered teacher himself. His writings and sermons emphasized strict adherence to Islamic law, education, moral reform and social justice. By the 1770s and 1780s, he had gained a significant following. His lectures drew students and admirers from across the Hausa states. Many were Fulani pastoralists, but others were Hausa townspeople, traders and even discontented members of the aristocracy. Dan Fodio was not merely a teacher, he had become a symbol of resistance against what many saw as corrupt rule and deviation from the core tenets of Islam. The rise of tensions in Gobir. Initially, Dan Fodio's presence was tolerated by the rulers of Gobir. He was even given permission to preach and educate freely, but as his influence grew, so did the concern of the ruling elite. The turning point came when Yunfa, a former student of Don Fodio, ascended to the throne of Gobir in the Yunfa, fearing the political power of his former teacher, revoked his privileges and ordered his exile. In 1802, tensions escalated dramatically. Yunfa allegedly attempted to assassinate Don Fodio. The attempt failed, but it marked the beginning of open hostility. Don Fodio and his followers fled Gobir and sought refuge in the town of Gudu. There in February 1804, something unprecedented occurred: the declaration of Jihad. In Gudu, Usman Don Fodio's followers formally declared him the Emir al-Mu'minin, the commander of the faithful. This declaration was more than symbolic. It signified the founding of a new state, the Sokoto Caliphate. With this title came authority to declare jihad, not as an act of aggression, but as a religious and social reform movement against rulers considered unjust and un-Islamic. Don Fodio issued letters and calls for support across the region. He appointed flag bearers, trusted lieutenants who would carry his message, and leadership into different Hausa states. The stage was set for a sweeping conflict, one that would reshape West Africa. The Fulani and the call to arms. The Fulani, a widespread pastoralist people, played a central role in the coming events. They had long maintained a semi-nomadic lifestyle, herding cattle across the Sahel. Many were devout Muslims, but they often found themselves marginalized by the ruling Hausa elite. Don Fodio's message resonated deeply with them. It offered religious legitimacy, political empowerment, and an opportunity to reshape the social order. Thousands of Fulani warriors, alongside others from different ethnic backgrounds, answered his call. What began as a localized dispute soon evolved into a mass mobilization. This was no longer a conflict between a scholar and a sultan. It had become a regional revolution. The opening engagements. In the early stages, the forces loyal to Don Fodio suffered setbacks. The Battle of Suntua, fought in late 1804, resulted in heavy losses for the jihadi forces, but they regrouped quickly, relying on guerrilla tactics and widespread popular support. From 1805 onward, momentum began to shift. The armies of the Caliphate, composed of scholars, pastoralists and townsmen, began capturing key cities across Hausa land. The populations, disillusioned with their rulers, often welcomed the change. In 1807, the city of Kano, one of the most important economic and cultural centers in the region, fell to the Caliphate. By 1808, more cities followed: Katsina, Dara, and eventually Gobir, where the conflict had first begun. Don Fodio, though increasingly delegating command, remained the spiritual and political leader of the movement. His writings guided the moral framework of the Caliphate, while his son Muhammad Bello began to assume administrative duties. By the end of 1808, the Sokoto Caliphate was no longer an idea, it was a functioning state. Its foundations had been laid through war, faith, and reform, and it would only grow from there. But the years ahead would test its cohesion, its leadership, and its ability to govern an increasingly vast and diverse territory. What began as a religious and social reform movement, led by a single scholar, had become a rapidly expanding state. The early victories against the Hausa kingdoms had not only reshaped the political map, but inspired new waves of military and religious campaigns. The Caliphate was now faced with the task of administering its growing territories, spreading its religious principles, and consolidating control. Over the next 3 decades, the Sokoto Caliphate would expand dramatically, absorbing neighboring regions, establishing new emirates, and transforming the religious and political landscape of the Sahel. The founding of Sokoto as capital. In 1809, as the Caliphate's territories continued to grow, Muhammad Bello, son of Usman Don Fodio, founded the city of Sokoto. This new city became the political and spiritual capital of the Caliphate. From Sokoto, the Sultan and his administrators would govern an emerging empire that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Usman Don Fodio himself retired from public affairs around this time, focusing on writing and religious instruction. He remained the symbolic leader of the Caliphate until his death in 1817, while Muhammad Bello assumed practical leadership. Alongside him, Abdullahi Don Fodio, Usman's brother, was tasked with governing the western provinces of the Caliphate. This created a dual leadership structure that allowed for more effective administration over such a vast and diverse territory. The structure of the Caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate, was not a centralized monarchy, but rather a confederation of emirates. These were semi-autonomous regions, governed by emirs who recognized the authority of the Sultan in Sokoto. Each emirate was led by an appointed leader, often a scholar or warrior, who had supported the early jihad. These emirs were responsible for enforcing Islamic law, collecting taxes, managing local affairs, and ensuring loyalty to the caliphate. In total, the caliphate grew to include over 30 emirates, stretching from what is now Burkina Faso in the west, to northern Cameroon in the east. It extended southward into Yorubaland, and northward into present-day Niger. This loose confederation allowed for flexibility and local adaptation, while maintaining a shared religious and political framework. Expansion through jihad and reform. From 1809 to the mid-1830s, the Sokoto Caliphate expanded through a combination of military conquest, religious reform, and settlement. Campaigns were launched into territories beyond Hausa. The Fulani, now fully mobilized under the banner of jihad, played a central role. They were joined by other ethnic groups, united by shared religious convictions or political grievance. In many cases, the expansion followed a familiar pattern. Local rulers were accused of violating Islamic principles, or oppressing their people. Letters were sent, demanding reform. If these were ignored, military action would follow. Cities such as Zamfara, Bida, and Ilorin were drawn into the caliphate's orbit. In some regions, resistance was met with force. In others, local elites aligned themselves with Sokoto in exchange for recognition and authority. The Fulani pastoralist population also began to settle in permanent communities, often supported by the caliphate's administration. New towns were founded, complete with fortified walls, mosques, markets and schools. These settlements became centers of religious learning, trade and governance. The role of slavery in the caliphate. During this period, the use of slavery became a central feature of the Sokoto Caliphate's economy and society. As a result of military campaigns, large numbers of non-Muslims were captured and enslaved. Many of these individuals were absorbed into the caliphate as agricultural laborers, domestic servants, or soldiers. Others were traded across regional networks. It is estimated that by the late 19th century, the Sokoto Caliphate had between 1 to 2.5 million slaves, making it one of the largest slave-holding societies in the modern world, second only to the American South in slaves were often encouraged to convert to Islam. Some were granted freedom after demonstrating loyalty and religious adherence. Still, the system remained a key element of both economic productivity and social organization. Islamic law and education. One of the defining features of the caliphate was its commitment to Islamic jurisprudence, or Sharia. Laws were derived from the Quran, Hadith, and the Maliki school of Islamic thought, which had long been established in West Africa. Legal codes governed property rights, marriage, trade and criminal justice. Judges, known as qadis, were appointed in each emirate. Their rulings were based on Islamic texts and precedent. Education flourished. Quranic schools were founded across the caliphate, offering instruction not only in religious texts, but also in mathematics, logic and the Arabic language. Scholars from Sokoto and other emirates authored dozens of texts, many of which survive today. This scholarly tradition gave the caliphate a reputation as a center of learning, attracting students and intellectuals from across the region. Religious conversion and social change. As the caliphate expanded, so too did the spread of Islam. In many areas, Islam had long coexisted with traditional beliefs. Now under the Sokoto system, religious observance became central to public life. Mosques were built in every town and village. Friday prayers, fasting, almsgiving, and other religious obligations were emphasized. The caliphate supported preachers, judges, and teachers who would carry the message of reform and education deep into rural areas. Over time, Islam became the dominant faith across northern Nigeria and much of the Sahel. The adoption of Arabic script and legal institutions altered cultural practices, property systems, and family life. However, not all regions embraced these changes willingly. In some areas, resistance to Islam and to the caliphate's authority persisted for years. Rebellions were not uncommon,
particularly in areas with strong indigenous traditions. Economic development and trade. The expansion of the caliphate also brought economic transformation. Trade routes were re-established and protected. Markets flourished in cities such as Kano, Zaria, and Sokoto. Goods including salt, textiles, leather, grains and livestock were exchanged within and beyond the caliphate's borders. The caliphate also encouraged agricultural development. Large plantations, often worked by enslaved laborers, produced surplus crops. Urban centers supported craftspeople, traders, and scholars, creating a complex and interdependent economy. The introduction of Arabic as a written language allowed for record-keeping, contracts, and communication across great distances. The peak of the caliphate. By the time of Muhammad Bello's death in 1837, the Sokoto Caliphate had reached its peak. It stretched from the fringes of the Sahara, in the north, to the forests of the Yoruba in the south, from the borders of modern-day Burkina Faso in the west, to the highlands of Cameroon in the east. Its population was estimated between 10 and 20 million people, making it the most populous empire in West Africa at the time. More than 30 emirates answered to Sokoto. While each retained a degree of autonomy, all recognized the authority of the Sultan, or Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful. The caliphate had become not only a political entity, but a religious and cultural force that would shape the history of the region for generations to come. In the decades that followed, the caliphate would face new challenges: internal dissent, foreign intrigue, and the growing ambitions of European empires. But for now, in the quiet halls of Sokoto and the bustling markets of Kano, a new order had taken root, one built upon faith, law, and learning.
Resistance and reform. The later years of the Caliphate, 1837–1885. By the 1830s, the Sokoto Caliphate stood at the height of its power. The vast confederation stretched across the western Sudan, its influence reaching into what is now Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon and Burkina. Over 30 emirates paid allegiance to the Sultan. Islam had become firmly established as the dominant religion of the region. Trade routes thrived, cities expanded, and new centers of Islamic learning emerged. But even as the caliphate reached its peak, signs of strain began to show. Maintaining cohesion across such a wide and diverse territory required careful balance. The authority of the Sultan was strong, but not absolute. Local rulers held considerable autonomy. Cultural, political, and even religious differences created challenges within the empire's own structure. This was a time of reform, but also of resistance. The succession of Muhammad Bello. When Usman den Fodio passed away in 1817, his son Muhammad Bello took up the leadership of the caliphate. For 2 decades, Bello had served as the chief administrator of Sokoto's growing empire. Upon assuming the sultanate, he dedicated himself to consolidating its structures. Bello was both a statesman and a scholar. He promoted Islamic law, strengthened educational institutions, and issued detailed legal codes to govern daily life. Under his rule, the city of Sokoto became not only a political capital but also one of the most respected centers of Islamic learning in West Africa. He appointed new emirs, supervised judicial reform, and worked to standardize tax collection and governance. Yet the size and complexity of the caliphate meant that inconsistencies remained. Some emirates deviated from his reforms, while others struggled to maintain security and order. Reform and resistance. While Islamic law was the foundation of the caliphate, not all emirates followed its implementation with the same rigor. In some regions, local rulers returned to traditional practices or allowed for the survival of customs that had previously been condemned. This divergence alarmed the central leadership in Sokoto. Muhammad Bello issued letters and instructions urging compliance with religious law. He sent scholars and jurists to guide local rulers and reassert Islamic authority. However, some communities resisted. In places like the Nupe Kingdom, Yorubaland, and parts of the Middle Niger Valley, older religious beliefs remained strong. Revolts and unrest occasionally flared as communities pushed back against the demands of Sokoto-appointed officials. In response, the caliphate launched new campaigns.
not only to re-establish control but also to continue its religious mission. The role of Abdullah dan Fodio and the Gwandu Caliphate. The western half of the empire was governed from Gwandu, under the leadership of Abdullah dan Fodio, brother of Usman dan Fodio. Though subordinate to Sokoto, Gwandu held significant autonomy and administered large territories in the west. Abdullah was an Islamic scholar in his own right. He issued legal rulings, led campaigns and managed the relationship between Sokoto and Emirates in what is now northwestern Nigeria, eastern Burkina Faso, and parts of southern Niger. After Abdullah's death, his successors continued to manage the western provinces, often in coordination with Sokoto, but sometimes in tension with it. These internal dynamics reflected the challenges of governing such a wide and varied empire. The conquest of the Nupe kingdom. One of the most important conquests during this period was that of the Nupe kingdom, located in central Nigeria. In the early 19th century, Nupe was a prosperous and well-organized state, known for its military strength and trade network. However, succession disputes and internal divisions weakened its stability. In 1806, forces under Abdullah dan Fodio began advancing into Nupe territory. Over the next 2 years, battles were fought across the kingdom. In 1808, the Nupe capital was captured. Its ruler was killed in battle. In the aftermath, the Sokoto Caliphate established the Bida Emirate, appointing a Fulani leader to govern on its behalf. Islam was introduced more fully into the region. Arabic script was adopted for writing the Nupe language, and new markets and trade routes were developed under Sokoto's influence. Tensions with the Oyo Empire. Further southwest, the powerful Oyo Empire had been declining for several succession crises, civil conflict, and external pressure had eroded its control. Sokoto's influence began to extend into Yorubaland through the city-state of Ilorin, which had once been part of Oyo. In the early 19th century, Ilorin broke away and allied itself with the Caliphate. With Sokoto's support, Ilorin launched military campaigns against Oyo and other Yoruba cities. By the mid-1800s, the Oyo Empire had collapsed entirely. Sokoto's presence in Yorubaland remained contested, however, as other Yoruba states resisted Fulani influence. These conflicts would continue for decades, complicating the Caliphate's expansion in the region. Islamic education and cultural flourishing. Despite the unrest in some regions, this era also witnessed a flourishing of Islamic scholarship and cultural production. Cities such as Sokoto, Kano, and Zaria became hubs of learning. Hundreds of scholars taught at Islamic schools, wrote books, and issued legal judgments. Arabic literacy became widespread among the elite. Religious texts were copied by hand, and libraries were established in major cities. Works by Usman dan Fodio, Muhammad Bello, and other scholars continued to shape thought and governance across the empire. Poetry, history, law, and theology were preserved in manuscripts, many of which survive today. This intellectual legacy remains one of the most enduring contributions of the Caliphate to the broader history of Islamic West Africa. Economic and agricultural development. The economic foundations of the Caliphate were based on agriculture, trade, and tribute. Large-scale plantations produced grains, cotton, and other crops. These estates were often maintained by enslaved labor. Markets connected emirates internally and linked them to wider trade networks extending to the Sahara and Atlantic coast. Sokoto itself became a center for the exchange of goods and ideas. Leather, textiles, salt, and horses moved across the Caliphate, often taxed by local authorities to support government and religious institutions. The stability of these networks contributed to the prosperity of cities and the growth of infrastructure, including roads, storage centers, and caravan stations. Mounting external pressures. By the 1870s and 1880s, however, the external world was beginning to close in. European interest in West Africa had intensified. Explorers, missionaries, and merchants were making increasing contact with the outer regions of the Caliphate. Reports filtered back to Europe of a vast Islamic state, rich in trade and culture, yet outside of colonial influence. The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 would formalize European claims across Africa. Although the Sokoto Caliphate remained untouched for the time being, its independence was becoming increasingly precarious. Britain, France, and Germany began to establish protectorates along the coastlines of West Africa. These would soon extend inland. The era of colonialism was approaching, and the Caliphate would have to prepare for the most serious threat it had ever faced. By the end of the 19th century, the Sokoto Caliphate remained the dominant power in West Africa, but its golden age was drawing to a close. What had begun as a jihad for reform had become a vast, intricate empire. It had endured for generations. Now its future hung in the balance. The fall of the Sokoto Caliphate, 1885–1903. As the 19th century came to a close, the Sokoto Caliphate remained one of the most powerful Islamic states in sub-Saharan Africa. Its territory stretched across the heart of West Africa, its political and religious structures deeply embedded across over 30 emirates, and its influence shaping the lives of tens of millions. But beyond its borders, the world was changing rapidly. European powers Britain, France, and Germany were redrawing the map of Africa. Colonial ambitions, once limited to coastal enclaves, were now moving inland. The Sokoto Caliphate, though vast and resilient, stood directly in the path of empire. This was the beginning of a final fateful chapter, the scramble for Africa. Between 1884 and 1885, European nations convened at the Berlin Conference to formalize their claims over the African continent. Though no African leaders were invited, the borders of future colonies were drawn, rivers were divided, and spheres of influence were assigned. Britain laid claim to large parts of modern-day Nigeria, including territories under the control of the Sokoto Caliphate. Germany moved into Cameroon. France expanded from the west, into territories bordering the Caliphate's western emirates. In these years, colonial forces began building forts, establishing protectorates, and negotiating with, or conquering local leaders. The Sokoto Caliphate, aware of the encroaching threat, sought to strengthen its internal structures, but diplomacy with European powers proved increasingly difficult. Growing tensions and explorers' reports. By the 1890s, European explorers and colonial agents had begun to make contact with the outer emirates of the Caliphate. Reports of the empire's size, organization, and resources made their way back to colonial capitals in Europe. In 1891, the French explorer Parfait Louis Montal visited Sokoto. He reported a strong but overstretched state, weakened by local rebellions and internal disputes. He noted that the Caliphate was engaged in conflict with Agunu, a rebellious emirate to the south. Despite this, Montal observed that Sokoto could still raise a large army. He recorded that Sultan Umaru bin Ali had summoned a force of 40,000 men, half of them cavalry, to lay siege to Agunu. But these were not the only pressures facing Sokoto. In the south, new European trading posts were becoming colonial garrisons. Rivalries between emirates were being exploited by foreign powers, and among some local populations, the legitimacy of Sokoto's central authority was beginning to fray. British strategy in the south. In southern Nigeria, the British had gradually expanded their control throughout the late 19th. By 1900, they had declared the creation of the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria, a colonial entity that encompassed many territories still governed by the Sokoto Caliphate and its affiliated emirates. To secure control, the British adopted a strategy of divide and rule. They cultivated alliances with discontented emirs, exploited regional rivalries, and offered protection to local rulers in exchange for loyalty. The man at the center of this strategy was Frederick Lugard, a colonial administrator and soldier. Lugard was determined to bring the Sokoto Caliphate under British authority. He viewed it as a political structure that could be dismantled and absorbed into the growing British colony. In 1902, Lugard launched a military campaign to capture Sokoto itself. The March on Sokoto. As British forces advanced northward, they encountered scattered resistance. Some emirates submitted quickly, either out of fear or in hopes of preserving a degree of autonomy. Others prepared for war. The Germans meanwhile invaded Adamawa from the east, further pressuring Sokoto's eastern flank. The French moved in from the west, tightening the noose around the empire. At the capital, Sultan Muhammadu Attahiro I prepared for the defense of Sokoto. Alongside him was Muhammad bin Anabwani, a respected military leader. Together they organized the defense of the city and rallied supporters, but the British advance was swift. In March 1903, Lugard's forces approached the city. They were well armed, equipped with modern rifles and artillery. Despite valiant efforts, Sokoto's defenders were outmatched. The city fell. Sultan Atahiru and his followers fled eastward, seeking refuge and hoping to regroup. The final hijra and death of the Sultan. After the fall of the capital, Sultan Atahiru led his supporters on a hijra, a migration eastward, through the lands of Hausaland, Bornu and Masina toward the frontier. This was both a physical and spiritual journey. Atahiru hoped to re-establish the caliphate, or reach refuge beyond the reach of colonial forces. But he was pursued. In June 1903, the British caught up with his forces near Burmi, on the border of modern-day Nigeria. A battle ensued. Sultan Atahiru was killed in combat. His followers, scattered and defeated, would never again assemble in such strength. With his death, the last symbol of political resistance to British rule within the caliphate was extinguished. The dissolution of the caliphate. On March 13, 1903, at the Grand Market Square of Sokoto, the Waziri, the caliphate's highest-ranking advisor, formally surrendered to the British. In place of a sovereign caliphate, the British created the Sokoto Sultanate Council. The title of Sultan was preserved, but stripped of its former power. It became a symbolic and religious position, recognized within the new Northern Nigeria Protectorate. The emirates were likewise incorporated into British administration. Many emirs retained their titles and positions, now serving under colonial rule as indirect rulers. Sokoto had fallen, but its institutions and culture would continue to influence the region. The end of resistance. Though some minor revolts continued, by 1906, all armed resistance to British rule had ended. The vast Islamic empire forged by Usman down Fodio and his successors had been brought under foreign control. The Sokoto Caliphate, which had lasted for nearly a century, was no more, but its legacy of religious reform, political unity and cultural influence would endure. The structures built by the caliphate were absorbed into colonial administration, and later into the framework of the modern Nigerian state. The memory of the caliphate remained alive, not only in historical texts, but in the identity of millions across the region. The fall of the Sokoto Caliphate marked the end of one era, and the beginning of another. An African empire born from faith and scholarship had now given way to the realities of global empire, yet the imprint it left on religion, governance, and culture would not be erased.
Sokoto's impact across West Africa and beyond. In the early 20th century, the Sokoto Caliphate came to an end as a sovereign state. The British conquest of 1903 marked the conclusion of its political independence, but its influence, religious, cultural, intellectual, and social, would outlast its territorial power. Across West Africa, the ideas, structures and reforms introduced by the Caliphate continued to shape societies in subtle and lasting ways. This is the story of what came after. Preservation through indirect rule. After the fall of Sokoto, the British administration faced a challenge: how to govern a vast and deeply Islamic region with minimal disruption. Rather than dismantle the structures of the caliphate completely, the British adopted a strategy of indirect rule. The system, pioneered by Frederick Lugard, allowed local rulers to maintain a degree of authority, as long as they pledged loyalty to the colonial government. The Sultan of Sokoto retained his title, though he no longer wielded political power. The emirs of the caliphate were likewise maintained in their roles, but now reported to British district officers. This arrangement helped the colonial state maintain control with limited resources, but it also ensured that many of the caliphate's administrative systems, legal traditions, and social hierarchies remained intact under British oversight. The continuity of Islamic law. In many parts of northern Nigeria, Sharia law continued to be practiced, especially in civil and family matters. The British created native courts, which often applied Islamic legal principles in accordance with local custom. This continuity preserved the judicial legacy of the caliphate. Judges, or qadis, continued to hear cases on marriage, inheritance, land disputes, and religious matters. While criminal law was brought under colonial control, the coexistence of Islamic and colonial legal systems laid the groundwork for post-independence debates around law, religion, and governance in modern Nigeria.
The role of the Sokoto Sultanate in the colonial era, though stripped of political control, the Sokoto Sultanate retained immense cultural and religious authority. The Sultan remained the most senior Islamic figure in the region, a position that carried weight among Muslims not just in northern Nigeria, but across West Africa. Succeeding sultans acted as spiritual leaders, arbiters of Islamic practice, and intermediaries between their communities and the colonial state. In times of crisis, whether drought, famine or political unrest, the Sultan's voice held influence. During both world wars, he urged his followers to cooperate with colonial authorities, helping to preserve peace and social cohesion. The title of Sultan came to symbolize continuity, a link between the past glory of the Caliphate and the changing realities of colonial rule. Intellectual legacy and Islamic scholarship. One of the most enduring contributions of the Sokoto Caliphate was its tradition of Islamic scholarship. This intellectual heritage remained vibrant even after the fall of the state. Sokoto, Kano, Zaria, and Katsina continued to serve as centers of religious learning. Quranic schools thrived, and scholars preserved the works of Usman dan Fodio, Muhammad Bello, and Abdullahi dan Fodio. Manuscripts copied in the 19th century were studied by new generations. Students traveled across the region to study with learned teachers, carrying with them the teachings of the Caliphate. This scholarly tradition helped unify the region's religious identity. It also contributed to the preservation of Arabic literacy, Islamic jurisprudence, and local interpretations of the Maliki school of Islamic law. Social hierarchies and cultural identity. The social structures introduced by the Caliphate continued to shape society under colonial rule, and beyond. At the top were the nobility, descendants of the jihadist leaders and Fulani aristocracy. Beneath them were free Muslims, followed by non-Muslims and enslaved persons. Though slavery was officially abolished by colonial authorities, forms of bonded labor persisted into the 20th. The economic and social status of former slave communities remained affected by this legacy for decades. At the same time, the Fulani identity, once closely tied to the leadership of the Caliphate, remained influential. Many Fulani families continued to hold positions of local authority, particularly in religious institutions and traditional leadership. The spread of Islam across West Africa. Perhaps the most significant long-term legacy of the Sokoto Caliphate was the spread of Islam across West Africa. The Caliphate's model, a network of emirates ruled under Islamic law, was emulated elsewhere. Its influence extended into northern Cameroon, where Fulani-led jihad movements had established states in the southern Niger, which had long-standing connections to Hausa and Fulani communities. Benin and Burkina Faso, where Sokoto's influence shaped local religious and political development. Islamic reform movements elsewhere, such as the Massina Empire and the Tukulur Empire, were inspired by the writings and model of the Sokoto Caliphate. In modern West Africa, Islam remains deeply rooted in the Sahel. The foundations laid by Sokoto continue to shape prayer traditions, legal interpretations and social customs from Nigeria to Senegal. Resistance, memory, and national identity. Though defeated militarily, the Sokoto Caliphate became a symbol of resistance and cultural pride in post-colonial Nigeria. During the early independence movements of the 20th century, many northern leaders traced their legitimacy to the legacy of the Caliphate. Politicians, religious figures and community elders invoked the memory of Usman dan Fodio as a model of just leadership, moral governance, and cultural independence. Even today, the Sultan of Sokoto remains a revered figure. He is recognized as the spiritual head of Nigeria's Muslim community, a role with both religious and symbolic importance. The Caliphate's memory lives on in public ceremonies, in school curricula, and in oral tradition. It remains a powerful part of the cultural identity of millions across northern Nigeria and the wider Sahel. Influence on modern governance and religion. The structures established by the Sokoto Caliphate laid the groundwork for many aspects of governance and religion in the region. The emirate system continues to operate as a traditional institution alongside modern governance. Islamic courts still function in parts of northern Nigeria under Sharia-based systems for civil matters. Religious leaders often play key roles in community mediation and conflict resolution. Educational networks founded in the 19th century have evolved into large Islamic institutions today. Despite political changes, the integration of religious and community life, a hallmark of the Sokoto Caliphate, remains a central feature of life in many parts of the region. The fall of the Caliphate in 1903 did not mark the end of its story. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase, one in which its ideas, teachings, and structures would spread beyond the boundaries of empire. Today, the legacy of the Sokoto Caliphate is reflected not only in history books, but in the rhythms of daily life, in prayer, language, leadership, and identity across West Africa. The Sokoto Caliphate, in modern memory, legacy, symbolism, and cultural resonance. More than a century has passed since the Sokoto Caliphate ceased to exist as a political state, yet its memory remains deeply embedded in the cultural, religious, and political life of West Africa. From the spiritual leadership of the Sultan to the preservation of traditional emirates, and from educational systems to public identity, the legacy of Sokoto continues to echo across time. The Sultan of Sokoto in contemporary Nigeria. Today, the Sultan of Sokoto holds the title of spiritual leader of Nigeria's Muslims. Though stripped of executive power by colonial rule, the Sultanate has retained significant religious and cultural authority. The Sultan presides over Islamic festivals, offers guidance on national religious matters, and serves as a unifying voice during moments of national crisis. In a country divided along ethnic, religious, and political lines, his role as a neutral and respected figure remains vital. The current sultan, like those before him, is a descendant of Usman dan Fodio, maintaining an unbroken link to the founders of the caliphate. His palace in Sokoto is a place of both historical symbolism and contemporary engagement, where modern governance intersects with enduring tradition. The emirate system today, across northern Nigeria, the emirate system continues to function as a traditional institution alongside modern democratic governance. While emirs no longer wield executive power, they play a crucial role in community leadership, conflict mediation, and cultural preservation. They are custodians of local customs, advisors in times of political tension, and champions of education and social welfare. In states such as Kano, Zaria, Katsina, and Gwandu, these emirs uphold the legacies of their historical predecessors, many of whom were appointed during the caliphate's formation in the early 90s. The continued presence of these emirates highlights the resilience of the structures created by the Sokoto Caliphate, even in a modern republic. Education and the preservation of knowledge. The Islamic educational tradition introduced by the Caliphate remains a cornerstone of cultural life in much of West Africa. Thousands of Quranic schools operate today, often modeled on the teaching structures developed under the Sokoto Caliphate. Many families continue to send their children to Islamia schools, where they study Arabic literacy, Islamic jurisprudence, and theology. At the university level, institutions such as Usman dan Fodio University in Sokoto reflect the Caliphate's enduring influence. Scholars continue to study the writings of Usman dan Fodio, Muhammad Bello, and Abdali dan Fodio, preserving their intellectual legacy. This transmission of knowledge has helped anchor religious identity in the region, while contributing to the broader field of Islamic studies worldwide. The legacy of Islamic law. In many northern Nigerian states, Sharia law has been formally reintroduced in civil matters, including family law, marriage, and inheritance. This return to Islamic legal frameworks mirrors the systems first codified under the Sokoto Caliphate. Debates over the role of Sharia in public life reflect ongoing tensions between tradition and modernity, between secular and religious governance. Yet for many communities, the application of Islamic law remains central to cultural identity and spiritual integrity. This continuity is not without challenges, but it reveals the depth of the Caliphate's influence, not as nostalgia, but as lived reality, memory and national consciousness. The Sokoto Caliphate occupies a unique place in Nigerian national memory. For some it represents a golden era of order, scholarship, and religious piety. For others it stands as a symbol of resistance, both against pre-colonial tyrannies and against European conquest. In northern Nigeria, the Caliphate is often invoked during political campaigns, cultural festivals, and public commemorations. Leaders draw on the moral authority of its founders to promote unity and leadership, yet its memory extends beyond Nigeria. In countries such as Niger, Cameroon, Benin and Burkina Faso, communities still trace their heritage to emirates founded during the Caliphate's expansion. The cultural and religious practices shaped by Sokoto's influence remain visible in architecture, language, clothing and legal tradition. The Caliphate as a source of identity. In a rapidly changing world, many people in northern Nigeria continue to see the Caliphate as a source of identity and stability. Its leaders were not only warriors but also scholars, judges and preachers. The fusion of political authority with moral and religious responsibility created a unique model of governance, one that many still regard with reverence. The Hijra of Atahiru the Fairest, in 1903, his final journey eastward in defiance of British rule, is remembered not only as a flight, but as a sacrifice, a symbol of faith and dignity. That memory, carefully preserved in oral tradition, continues to inspire those who seek meaning in their modern reflections, a living legacy. In literature, film, public discourse, and education, the Sokoto Caliphate remains an enduring subject. Museums in Sokoto preserve relics from the Caliphate era, swords, manuscripts, robes and artifacts that once belonged to Usman dan Fodio and his family. Historians and theologians continue to examine its impact on state formation, legal traditions, and religious movements. Conferences and academic studies explore how its teachings can inform contemporary debates on governance, justice and social cohesion. Across West Africa, communities remain bound by shared memories of Sokoto, by its rise, its reign, and its transformation. Though the Sokoto Caliphate no longer rules by sword or decree, its presence endures in the quiet call to prayer, in the intricate script of ancient manuscripts, and in the footsteps of those who walk the same paths their ancestors did. It remains a story not of loss but of continuity, a legacy forged through faith, learning and leadership, living still in the hearts of millions.